Good, how are you?
Doing well, thanks. I just wanted to let you know Thursday I won't be here because I have a group presentation.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started, please. All right, so there's really not much in the sense of announcements, but regardless, there's just one thing in particular that I want to talk about, which is the exam. So I did post your exam 2 scores yesterday, and as I sent in the email, the overall class average was a 72. I'm sorry, I was thinking about the highest score. 72, 73. It's really on the border end of the 72, so I would call it a 73. The high score was a 98%, so I figured I'd let you guys know that. And then your next exam, remember, is going to cover the remainder of the material up until reproduction. Reproduction will be the only thing that is new material for your final, okay? That's the only chapter that'll be new material for the final. So what that tells you then is that the final is majority cumulative, okay? And the smaller part is new material. I'm not going to tell you any exact breakdowns today, but I will give you some information about it just because some people have already started to ask. So for the final exam, the new material portion is structured exactly like your other exams. So it has multiple choice, fill in the blank, and essay questions. The cumulative portion is only multiple choice. So there is no fill in the blank, no essay portion that is cumulative, okay? So just to keep that in mind. And then on D2L, you have practice essays for the remainder of the semester. So there's a couple practice essays for respiratory, for kidney stuff, and there is reproductive practice essays as well. So you have essentially all of that available to you. There is a large number of worksheets as well. We're probably going to do almost all of them together, so they're up there. You don't have to print them again. I'll bring them to class. All of those kind of class rules, I guess, still stand, okay? You guys will have 2 more homework assignments. There is the 3rd homework assignment, which is going along material for exam 3. I will post that today. I have a pretty big suspicion that nobody's going to do it next week, but regardless, I'll post it today if you want it available. And I'll simultaneously do that with the online submission. And then you'll have a 4th homework, which will, again, just be reproductive. So that homework is meant to help you with the new material. There is no cumulative homework, okay? It might seem early for some people to talk about this, but it really isn't that early to talk about this. And again, this is the final exam. As you guys start preparing and putting together your materials for that exam and to review, you do not want to spend a substantial amount of time reading what at that point is going to be well over 300 slides, okay? It is way too time consuming and not the best way to use your time. Instead, what you want to do is use those learning goals, the worksheets, clicker questions, and homeworks. That's it. Because that really consolidates material. And now that in and of itself is a decent amount of material. So make sure that you're staying on top of your learning goals, that you've stayed on top of the worksheets, that you have copies of that. All the keys are on D2L, so you have that available to you there as well, okay? For the homeworks, you'll always be able to go in and see your submissions. And for the exams, when we get closer and closer, of course, you're going to want to view all 3, and that will always be a possibility. I do know that this week you cannot see exam 1. Only reason being is because there was a adding by the grad TA on the fill in the blank, and he took away more points than he should have. So you guys will be getting somewhere between a 1/4 point to a 1/2 point back, most of you, unless you got obviously perfect score on that page. So that won't happen till during spring break or so because he's working on tallying that up again. Because of that, I don't have your guys' exams for exam 1, but I do have all of exam 2s, okay? You guys can still come view those office hours on Thursday. And if my office hours don't work, keep in mind that I do whatever I can to make an appointment so that we can meet and talk about your exam. Any questions? Okay, so I actually want to start with showing you a video It's a very brief video, but it's going to help us understand the concepts that we are about to talk about. And so what you have in this picture are lungs, okay? They are lungs from a cat, and they are going to be artificially filled with air, right? And so it works a little different than how the system would work naturally, but it does help me to demonstrate to you a couple of concepts that are extremely important when understanding lung function. So when I start the video, you're going to watch the lungs inflate, right? And then you kind of see them, what looks like collapse or flatten out. Now, what I want you to understand about the video, because you're obviously not doing this procedure, so you don't know exactly what's going on, is that there is air being forced through an apparatus, like a respirator, into the lungs, okay? But there is no suction. There's no air being pulled out of the lungs. So the only air that is moving at all is the air that's going into those lungs, okay? There is no air that's going or being sucked out of the lungs. And that does end up becoming a really important concept, because looking at that video, you can see that with air going in, it's super easy for those lungs to turn that really pale pink that they turned. And then all of a sudden, they just kind of flatten and they collapse without air having to be suctioned out. So how is something like that possible? Or what is it about the lung that allows it to fill so easily, but then at the same time collapse the way that it does, so that it can expel the air that's already in it? So that's the link to the video, and I'll put it on detail if you guys want, but really you can just type it in and you'll find it. But regardless, it's two concepts and two properties that the lung possesses: compliance and elastance. And both of these properties of the lung allow it to do what we just saw: fill really, really easily and empty without any work having to be done. You don't have to suction anything. You don't have to push on the lungs. You don't have to squeeze the lungs. They will empty passively, or they will get rid of the air that's in them without any effort being put in. So let's kind of define the difference between compliance and elastance, because they are two different concepts, although sometimes their definitions and what they really mean do get confused. So compliance. Compliance is a measure of stretchiness, or the ability to stretch. And there is an actual calculation that can be done for compliance, which takes into account several different factors. You can determine the compliance of a PVC pipe, of a lead pipe, of a rubber hose, and so on, okay? The lungs have a very, very high compliance, and therefore stretch extremely easily. It is one of the structures in your body with the highest compliance, much more so than some of your bigger arteries. While they are a little bit compliant, because they do stretch with blood pressure, the lungs are even more compliant, okay? As something starts to lose compliance, or if something is not compliant at all, then it just basically means it's not stretchy. So if we are comparing, let's say, a PVC pipe to an artery, the artery has much more compliance than the PVC pipe does, because that PVC pipe isn't really going to have too much stretchability to it. The lungs, again, under normal circumstances, are extraordinarily compliant. Very, very stretchy. They can lose their compliance. And the loss of compliance is typically a disease process. So it can be because of inflammation. And sometimes people have inflammatory processes in the lungs, and over time, inflammation causes scar tissue. Scar tissue is very rigid, right? It's very strong, it's full of collagen, it's compacted tissue. And that's what this picture shows. This picture actually shows a lung that was diseased. What disease, we don't know, but it's probably an inflammatory process that caused the lung to become very stiff. And when the lung does become stiff, compliance goes away. So it's not as easy to stretch that lung. Now, from a standpoint of mechanical work, the intercostals and the diaphragm, right? A lung that is less compliant is going to do what to your mechanical workload? Increase it, right? So it starts to become somewhat difficult to breathe because you really have to fight against the poor compliance. Otherwise, if you think about the breathing you're doing just sitting in your chairs, although there's ATP being expended because you're contracting the diaphragm and the intercostals, it isn't energetically costly, right? Your muscles aren't burning out, your muscles aren't fatiguing, you aren't getting stressed, you're not feeling this tiresome process in breathing. And that's because of the compliance, okay? Surfactant helps with compliance. Because we can break that surface tension of water with surfactant, having the proper amount of surfactant makes sure that we are fully compliant. If surfactant levels start to decline, then your lung becomes less compliant, not because the tissue is becoming damaged like it does in that picture, but because surface tension is so high. And with that high surface tension, again, you have to put a lot of workload into breaking it to get those lungs to expand. On the other side of the spectrum is this concept of elastance. And this is where the confusion oftentimes comes about. Because you hear the word stretchy, and for whatever reason, you automatically think it's elastic. Because it's stretchy, it's elastic. And that is not true. Things can be stretchy and have zero elastance or very poor elasticity. So for example, chewing gum, right? After you've chewed on your gum, it is rather compliant because you can take it out of your mouth and it'll stretch really easily. You can pull on it really easily. If you were to let that gum go after you've pulled it apart, chances are it's probably just going to stay like that. I mean, it might kind of wiggle back into something, but it certainly isn't going to turn into a ball like it did when it was in your mouth, right? Elastance is the ability to recoil back to your original state, back to your original size. The lungs not only have this incredible stretchiness and this incredible compliance, but they are also very elastic, extremely elastic, okay? So much to the point where if you do perforate the thoracic cage and air from the environment enters into the pleural cavity, the elasticity of the lung causes it to collapse. And so it flattens out, and that's what a collapsed lung truly is. The elasticity is so great that the lung just recoils into this little ball because there's nothing holding it open anymore. So that deflation of the lung that you saw in the video was completely passive, meaning there's no work being put in, there's no air being sucked out, nothing's happening. All they do to allow that air to leave is turn off the ventilator. Because the lungs are so elastic, they just collapse and the air gets pushed out by the lungs themselves. That same series of concepts applies in a living system. The only difference is that there's no forceful pushing of air into the lungs. Instead, the air enters into the lungs because of pressure gradients, which we're going to talk about more so today. You can also destroy your lung elasticity, or you can lose elastance in the lungs, primarily because of toxins or things that you breathe in that cause inflammatory effects and activation of the immune system in a way that is more dangerous than just simply fighting against a pathogen. What will happen in a lot of these cases is you activate macrophages with some of that inflammatory effect, and those macrophages can activate certain enzymes, but also it's kind of this spiraling effect where macrophages not only degrade pathogens, but they actually can degrade healthy tissue as well. They'll start to degrade the elastic fibers. And so in this picture, all of these kind of what they actually look like little rubber bands wrapping around the bronchi. Those are your elastic fibers. And the macrophages will start to degrade those. So the lung loses elasticity. It is very commonly seen, not with a simple like I said, pathogenic disease, but more so with prolonged chronic exposure to toxins like cigarette smoke. So the things that are in cigarette smoke can cause this process to occur. Over time, as you degrade more and more of those elastic fibers, the lungs again lose their elasticity. So it's harder for them to deflate, right? That is pretty much a hallmark of emphysema. Emphysema is when those lungs don't deflate as well as they should because of the loss of elasticity. There's some surface area loss as well, which causes problems with gas exchange. But if you have ever seen somebody who's had emphysema for a prolonged period of time, they have what is called a barrel chest, where their chest really looks like it's protruding out. Okay? And a lot of the reason for that is because of the inability to deflate those lungs well, because of the loss of that elasticity. Another thing that happens commonly, which is a combination of illnesses, and you've heard about it, I'm sure, on TV with all of the different ads, is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is COPD. Now, COPD is actually going to be characterized by a couple of different things: inflammation of the lungs and an increased production and thickening of mucus in the lumen of the bronchiole. Chronic inflammation of the lungs can lead to a buildup of scar tissue. Which of the following symptoms, because of that then, would you expect to see? Okay.
I said I didn't think it would be A because if you had more fluid in the lungs, then it would actually increase the surface area where oxygen and carbon dioxide could exchange. And I don't think you'd see an increase in ease of inflating the lungs, actually, because of inflammation decrease the lines of the lungs.
Okay, so it can't be A for a couple of reasons. One, increased surface area isn't really something that we would expect to even see with a disease process. And in addition to that, it's not related to fluid. If there's fluid buildup in the lungs, that doesn't affect surface area as much as it does diffusion distance. And what you're doing here is increasing distance, which would make it harder for these gases to diffuse, as opposed to easier in any way at all. For B, we can see compliance in here, which seems like a key word because we talked about scar tissue. But if you look at the relationship with scar tissue buildup and the relationship here with compliance, it doesn't fit right. Okay, although B statement is a true statement because it would be easy to fill the lungs with increased compliance, that's not what we'd expect with scar tissue. With scar tissue, you would expect decreased compliance and it would be harder to fill those lungs. So we're left with only C, reduced airflow due to a decrease in airway diameter. So there's inflammation. Inflammation causes kind of a puffiness in the tissue, which can restrict that airway. There's mucus, buildup of mucus, more so than is normal, which will also reduce that diameter. So this should kind of start jogging your memory a little bit about some of the things that we learned for cardiovascular, because those exact same concepts are about to come up again. If there is a change in diameter of tube, there's going to be a change in the amount of flow through the system. To a certain extent, yes, simply because gases have varying solubilities. And they have different solubilities in different mediums. And so when we go from air to water and that kind of stuff. So it can affect those gradients. But what you're going to see when we do gas exchange is that thanks to a couple of mechanisms our body has, we don't worry too much about that because we're able to accommodate for the solubility difference in liquid. So we'll see kind of where that comes about later on. Okay? So that brings me then to this concept, which is something that should look very familiar. When we talk about flow, through the respiratory system, we are applying the exact same principles that we did for cardiovascular for blood. So flow in this case is flow of air. And we're not talking about oxygen and carbon dioxide. We're talking about total air volume from atmosphere into lungs and then from lungs back out into the atmosphere. In order for there to be flow, there has to be a change in pressure. So again, air is going to flow from a high to low pressure system, okay? And then as that air flows, it's going to encounter resistance. The higher the resistance, the harder the airflow. The smaller the resistance, the easier the airflow will be, okay? So exact same things we talked about cardiovascular-wise. Now, what makes it a little bit interesting is how are we generating this change in pressure? Because we know that for the cardiovascular system, we generated pressure in the heart. The heart contracted, it created force, it pushed on blood. That's where the pressure came from. But for the respiratory system, we really don't have a pump. And we're not constantly connected to a ventilator that's forcing high pressure air into the lungs. So there's another way in which we create a pressure gradient. And that is by creating a differential pressure between the alveoli and the atmosphere. And we'll talk about how we do that by relating it to Boyle's law of volume and pressure, where we can see volume changes lead to pressure changes, which can then create that differential needed for there to be high to low pressure systems and airflow. Okay? When we talk about these pressure changes and airflow, we're going to talk about it in the same manner that we did for the cardiac stuff, which is within a single cycle. So we're going to define a lot of movement and pressure change within what's called a respiratory cycle. And that respiratory cycle is from the beginning of inspiration all the way through to the end of expiration. So you take one breath in, one breath out. That whole thing, that combination of those two things is one respiratory cycle, okay? And within each respiratory cycle, you might make adjustments and you might make changes. And we'll talk a little bit more about like volumes and how we measure the total amount of air that enters into the lungs per breath as well as per minute, okay? Let's talk a little bit more about resistance because it, again, is an important concept, and it comes up not only in cardio, but again here. So we want to make sure we understand that concept of resistance. Now, that being said, which of the following statements regarding resistance in the respiratory tract is true? The trachea has the least amount of resistance. Airflow in the bronchioles is increased due to a decrease in resistance. The trachea has a much higher airflow than the bronchioles. Combination A and C, or all of them. You always sit in the back, and you throw me off when you sit somewhere else. Of course I noticed. I noticed most of you guys, especially because you had me in Phys 1 too, didn't you?
Unless you remember me from like 5 years ago.
Oh, really?
You probably.
No.
No,
Then I just noticed you this semester then, because you normally sit way over there. Yeah.
Yeah, so about areas.
Sure.
Next semester?
Yeah.
There's another section of it that's 2 to 250, and it's 3 credits. So
That's the one you're supposed to sign up for.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know what
there's
the...
one on there that's 1 credit, and it's 99.
Oh, no. You're talking about the clinical nutrition... The
it's
nutrition
a seminar. It's, what is it?
Yeah, but so is the nutrition class. So the nutrition class is a seminar, and so is the Pathophys class. They're both seminars.
It says you're teaching it, though.
I am. I'm teaching the nutrition class and Pathophys.
Okay.
I'm teaching both.
There we go.
Yeah, so the Pathophys is 3. They're both 3 credits.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is it? The nutrition one says it's 1, though. That's the one that says it's 1 credit.
Yeah, no, it shouldn't
The
be.
99.50?
It's...
So are you going to be in, are you going to be dissecting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So-
just make it work. I'll fit it in there. I make everything work. I'm not, sorry. Is she doing it again? Oh, I didn't know she was going to do it again. Really? Yeah. I didn't know she was going to teach it. She offered it first, like 2 or 3 years ago. So I wonder if she asked again and they told her sure. You understand her. I will be. I usually take 3. And just so you know, I already have 2 people that asked me. So, I take anybody who wants to do it, and I just look at everybody and then select. So it's not like a first come, first serve, just so you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it has to. You have to go to the seminars because it's a seminar course. I should probably say something. It's on the seminar. Yeah. It is at 9 a.m. though. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Then it works, right? All right, a couple more seconds. Okay. So, again, somebody please tell me what you chose and why. So what do you think is a true statement regarding resistance in the respiratory tract? Grant.
Okay, I'm fighting between A and D. A I know is definitely true because it has the largest radius. Now, D, because C may be true, but it depends on whether we're talking about the combined airflow versus the trachea versus the bronchial.
So, okay. So starting with your choice for A, you said A because the trachea is the largest. If you think about your respiratory tract, it's the biggest one, right? And so because of that, you feel like that's going to have the least resistance. Now, if you relate resistance to flow, then I would argue with you that C does match with that just because resistance and flow go together. Now, in terms of this resistance in the respiratory tract, I want you to think for a minute, what did we say about aorta versus capillaries? So what do we say about trachea versus bronchioles? How many bronchioles do you have? Tons, right? How many tracheas do you have? I'm guessing 1, right? So that being said, what is the correct answer here? B. B is the correct answer. And only B. I got you guys twice. You guys, come on. So, first time I asked this question, settle down for a minute. First time I asked this question, it was for arteries, capillaries, all that business, right? And I showed you that diagram about one aorta and its total area versus capillaries and how we have billions of capillaries. So the resistance is actually the least in your capillaries. Exact same concept applies here. The resistance is highest in the trachea. Actually, it's highest in the primary bronchi. And then it's the lowest in the bronchioles. Remember that all medium, air, water, liquids, everything, will travel the path of least resistance. It is way too hard to have air flow to an area that is increasing in resistance. So you have to take the total, the sum of all your bronchioles, because think about airflow. It doesn't go from the trachea to one bronchi to one bronchiole to one alveolus. It diverges, it spreads out, okay? So your resistance actually is the lowest in those bronchioles because we take the full sum or the full total effect of all of those bronchi. The other factors can be ignored, just like we ignored it for cardiovascular. So don't worry about viscosity. Don't worry about length, because the length of the respiratory tract really doesn't change once you're an adult. If you compare an adult to a child, there's a difference, but as an adult, it's not changing, okay? And viscosity, that's the air viscosity. Really, the only thing that can change that is humidity. It is a little bit harder to bring in air when it's 100% humid outside, but really it's not so significant that it's going to affect your respiratory tract or your ability to easily breathe. So when you take a look at this then, you see that the trachea is one with a cross-sectional area of only about 2.5 centimeters squared. And if we come all the way to those bronchioles, their total cross-sectional area is much, much larger. That's why their resistance is so low. And that really helps us to understand why air actually flows so easily into the alveoli and does not require a substantial amount of work. It's because of that low resistance. You can change resistance in that respiratory tract, and it will happen primarily by altering the bronchioles. Okay? So here's a graph that represents airway generation and resistance. As I mentioned, in the bronchi here, there is a slight increase in resistance. Your respiratory system overcomes that increase in resistance because as air first enters into the respiratory tract, it has enough velocity to it and enough pressure to it that it can overcome that high resistance. It's kind of like overcoming a little bit of a hurdle before it just is easygoing thereafter. So once you kind of get past those medium bronchi, resistance plummets all the way down to where it's the lowest in those bronchioles. Okay? So sometimes you will get, let's say, wheezy. It'll be hard to breathe, or it feels like you're really trying to suck air and it's just not working as well as it is supposed to. And then other times you'll feel like, you are stealing everybody else's air. It feels like you're bringing in tons of air and you are breathing super, super easily. And the main reason that can happen is because you can adjust resistance. You can change resistance in the entire respiratory tract, just like changing resistance in the cardiovascular system. If we increase the resistance in that respiratory tract, it's going to be harder for air to flow. But if you decrease the resistance, it's going to be easier for air to flow. The primary place where resistance changes occur will be where there is a lot of smooth muscle, because smooth muscle can relax to cause the dilation or contract to cause the constriction. And the place where that occurs in that respiratory tract is your terminal bronchioles. The terminal bronchioles are analogous to arterioles, where you can adjust resistance, which will then help you adjust flow. Okay? You can also adjust flow by changing pressure gradients. I mean, you guys know that you could take a really little wimpy breath, or you could take a huge deep breath, right? You are consciously adjusting your volume, which adjusts pressure gradients. But from the standpoint of physiological effects, you can also adjust that diameter. So how does some of this happen? We have local paracrine responses that will change broncho diameter. So one of the paracrines that will change the overall diameter of the bronchiole is carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide is a gas that we like to keep because it helps maintain blood pH, but we also need to get rid of it because if we don't get rid of it, then it's going to alter that blood pH. Sometimes, dependent on the quality of air, dependent on what might be happening in the alveoli for exchange, carbon dioxide concentrations in the alveoli as part of your expired air can go up or can go down. That paracrine signaling within the air supply can change flow by adjusting overall diameter. So if carbon dioxide levels are high, then we're going to create a relaxation of the smooth muscle. That leads to the dilation of those bronchioles, and when they dilate, it increases flow. That helps to enhance the ability to get rid of this carbon dioxide. So you breathe it out easier, which means you are expelling that CO2 more readily. And that then helps to make sure that you're balancing the overall concentrations of gases in the alveoli so that they don't offset, which then can affect blood concentrations. That is one mechanism from a very local standpoint that can help adjust flow due to changes in resistance. Another chemical that has been shown to really affect your airflow is histamine. Histamine is released by the immune system primarily. So when the immune system becomes activated, some cells of that immune system release this chemical histamine, and it has many effects. But when focusing specifically on the lungs, histamine will cause bronchoconstriction. So that histamine is released, it binds to receptors on the smooth muscle, and it activates a cascade of intracellular effects, which will cause smooth muscle contraction. As those bronchioles constrict, it increases resistance, which makes airflow harder. Okay? This is the reason why sometimes people will get a difficulty breathing when they are exposed to a pathogen. It also is one of the steps involved with an allergic response. So although allergies are kind of a strange thing to understand, and why some people are allergic to some things and others are not, what we do know is that the allergic responses do activate inflammatory responses. And along with that comes histamine release. When histamine does get released and causes this bronchoconstriction, the theory is that you're trying to protect the respiratory tract from whatever's trying to get in from getting in. And if you increase that resistance, airflow is really hard. So you are limiting the amount of, let's say, pathogen from getting into the system. In terms of allergic responses, can be pretty detrimental, right? Depending on how severe your allergy is. And so when somebody gets what we call anaphylaxis, that is such a significant immune effect that the airways constrict so much that they shut. They shut completely. And so a person can't breathe, right? Those people who are known to have those types of allergies, peanuts, bees are typical ones, they always walk around with an EpiPen, right? And so we'll discuss why the EpiPen here is so effective when we take a look at kind of the other aspect of bronchoconstriction. Antihistamines are, so there's a lot over the counter. You don't really need them prescribed, but the stronger ones are prescribed. They are, in this case, to help reduce the amount of histamine production and release to alleviate allergic symptoms. And so the runny nose, the itchy eyes, the redness in the face, that kind of stuff is really the big component that the antihistamines help with, because it reduces the synthesis and release of the histamine itself. So the last component that can affect your bronchioles is the autonomic nervous system. This parasympathetic effect exists. It does have an effect on the bronchioles, which is mostly a constrictive effect. So the acetylcholine release causes bronchoconstriction. But the sympathetic effect is a very, very significant one, much more so than parasympathetic. It creates a bigger effect, and it creates a bigger response. The sympathetic effect is to always cause bronchodilation. Okay? So we talked about two separate receptor types that are found on smooth muscle and are associated with the sympathetic nervous system. So they're adrenergic receptors. So what were those two receptors? We just finished talking about them in cardio. So they're on smooth muscle. Alpha is one, and beta what? Beta 2s, okay? So when the alpha receptor got activated, what was the response? Constriction. And when the beta 2s got activated, what was the response? Was dilation. The smooth muscle of your bronchioles are very heavily populated with beta 2 receptors. So that when you activate that sympathetic nervous system and release epinephrine, as well as norepinephrine, it binds to those beta 2 receptors, causes relaxation of the smooth muscle, and bronchodilation. This is why people who have those very severe allergies are always walking around or equipped or have nearby an EpiPen, because the EpiPen inserts a large amount of epinephrine, travels through the blood very quickly, and gets to its targets, which are not just the lungs, but will include other places. Primarily what you're interested in is the lungs, to cause a vasodilation to offset that allergic effect. And so it causes dilation, and those people don't get complete seals or closes of their respiratory tract. Okay? Same concept behind albuterol inhalers. Albuterol inhalers are beta 2 agonists. They're designed to bind to this receptor and cause dilation of these particular bronchioles. When you read, if anybody is on an albuterol inhaler, if you've ever used one, a common side effect is a headache. So a lot of people wonder, well, how is that a common side effect? If it's coming to my lungs, I breathe it in, how is it causing a headache? And the reason why is because that chemical, it can get into the blood. It'll diffuse into the blood. And when it does so, it'll travel throughout the body, and act on any other receptor that will accept it, which will include the beta 2 receptors on the arterioles that go to your brain. So you increase blood flow to the brain. It increases a little bit of cranial pressure, which causes the headache. And so that's why that can be one of those side effects associated with using an albuterol inhaler. It's not the same as your Advair. Your Advair discs are a little bit different. They do have a beta agonist in them, but they have other things in them as well. And those are typical of more like prolonged asthma, COPD, that kind of stuff. Okay? Good. So let's say that Amy is out with her family and she eats a strange berry. Suddenly she realizes, or rather she starts wheezing, and it becomes very difficult for her to bring in a sufficient amount of air. If that happens, which of the following statements do you think could be true? And so we're looking at all of these as being something that's happening to cause her issue. So epinephrine release has increased. A chemical in the berry acts as an agonist of muscarinic receptors. Amy has had an allergic reaction, causing her histamine levels to decrease, or a combination of these things. Say it again.
What causes hiccups?
Spasms of the diaphragm. And so it could be, it could be really anything that causes a spasm. Just like you get twitch in like your leg or something like that, electrolyte imbalance, or yeah, sometimes it can be really bad because of spasms. There's a neurological issue, usually with the phrenic nerve causing something to not function right, and so the muscle spasms all the time. It's because of what you're doing respiratory-wise. And so because you, like if you scare somebody, you kind of stop them from breathing for a minute. And so then the diaphragm isn't really working, and it has a minute to kind of like reset from its spasm, and then it gets better again. Yeah. Couple more seconds. Okay. So again, somebody please tell me what you picked and why. What could be true? Yes. Okay. Good. So it's just B, right? We know that parasympathetic system can have an effect. There are muscarinic receptors on there, even though from a physiological standpoint, you might not see that much parasympathetic innervation or at least activation really. You're mostly looking at that huge sympathetic effect. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And if you have an exogenous chemical that somehow acts as an agonist here, then it can create these effects, right? So if we have an agonist to that muscarinic receptor, then we can create the constriction that could potentially lead to these issues. Good. Okay, so now that we understand the resistance factor, let's talk about pressure. Pressure is the way in which air is going to be able to move. And what I mean by that is, again, we're creating a gradient, right? We know that ions move across membranes because there's a concentration gradient. We know that blood moves through the cardiovascular system because there's a pressure gradient. And so now the same can be said about air. Air will move through the respiratory tract because there is a pressure gradient. The absolute lowest pressure can be found during an inspiratory cycle in the lungs. And then the highest pressure during an expiratory cycle will be found in the lungs as well. So the lungs can actually change their total pressure. And that's where the gradient occurs. Unless you move physical locations, you cannot change the total pressure in the air around you. Okay, that pressure is what it is. In Boulder, it's about 623, roughly. Depends on the day, but that's roughly where it's at. So that's not going to change. Rather, you can change interthoracic pressure, alveolar pressure. And in order to understand how we do that, we're going to talk about Boyle's law a little bit, which relates volume to pressure. If you look at this particular scenario, granted you have to use your imagination just a little bit because the respiratory tract is not a closed system. It is open. But we can still apply this concept well to understand kind of what's going on. So this is kind of the first snapshot that we're taking a look at. And we can see that there is some air in a container. And again, it's a closed system here. And the pressure of that air can be measured. Now, pressure is essentially a representation of the molecular collisions that are going on the inside, right, of all the molecules that are in there. For this particular scenario here, we have 1 liter encased within this beaker, and the air that's in here is exerting a pressure of about 100 millimeters of mercury. Now, keep in mind that for pressures in physiology, we always use millimeters of mercury. That is a little bit not opposite, but different than what you might do in like a physics class or physical chemistry. When they talk about the atmosphere, they don't really use millimeters of mercury. They might use atmospheres or torr, right? We're going to stick with millimeters of mercury. It's just a difference in nomenclature. There's really no difference in concepts associated with what we're doing, okay? Now, what Boyle's law tells us is that when volume changes, pressure within the system will also change. And the way in which it changes is described by looking at Boyle's law, where pressure 1 and multiplied by volume 1 equals pressure 2, volume 2. Simply put, okay, so let's try to simplify this and make it as easy as possible. If volume in a system goes down, pressure will go up. And if volume in a system goes up, pressure will go down. That's all you have to remember, okay? If you are very mathematical, you can solve this equation. So if I give you a volume, you can plug and chug, figure out the different numbers, right? I'd have to give you some information, but you could do it if you want to. But you can also simplify it. If I give you a volume and a pressure, and I tell you that the volume has increased, then all you know is that the pressure's decreased. So you want to look for smaller numbers. Okay? The relationship here becomes really important because, again, you can't change the volume of your atmosphere. That's not something you can do. But you can change the volume of your lungs. And when you change the volume of your lungs, you change the pressure within them. That then can create the pressure gradient that you need for air to move out of the lungs or into the lungs. Okay? So we talked a little bit about those pleural, the serous membranes. Parietal pleura, visceral pleura, how they're suctioned together, right? And how they're fixed to the rib cage. We use that particular anatomy to our advantage, add in some skeletal muscle, and we're able to change lung volume, okay? Biggest muscles to pay attention to in terms of ventilation will be the diaphragm. So you can see the diaphragm kind of domed up in there. The diaphragm will account for most of your thoracic volume changes, as you will see here in just a moment. The external intercostals, they play a role in breathing in, okay? Remember, those are the ones between the ribs. And then there are some additional muscles that will contribute. Sternocleidomastoid, scalenes, and the abdominals. Now, when you are breathing in a way that we consider to be quiet, restful breathing, like what you're doing right now, the only muscles you use are your diaphragm and your external intercostals, okay? And you only use them to breathe in. If you are doing quiet, restful breathing, you use 0 muscles to breathe out, okay? Now, why are these other muscles listed? The scalenes do a little bit of work, even in restful breathing, but it's relatively minimal. These other muscles are listed because sometimes you're not just doing restful, quiet breathing. If you're exercising, you need more than just the diaphragm and the external intercostals. So sternocleidomastoid, scalenes, and even the abdominals can help kind of force a little bit extra volume change. And you can see that in somebody who's just finished a run or who's done something very strenuous. Their necks look a little bit tenser as they're breathing, and their abdomen, it almost looks like they're breathing with their stomachs, just because the abdominals are helping to create a little bit more volume change, which helps create just that much more pressure gradient to get more volume going. Okay? Breathing out, again, is fully passive. It means you don't use any muscles to breathe out when you are doing quiet, restful breathing. The only thing you are depending on is the elasticity of the lungs. Okay? Now, there are times where you need to force a little extra air out. You need to breathe more air out than just your quiet, restful breathing. In that case, you will use muscles. The muscles you will use are the internal intercostals, and again, the abdominals. The abdominals can help on both sides here. If you compress that abdominal cavity, that helps to kind of push a little bit more air out. And again, the intercostals. But when you are in that resting state, you don't use any muscles to breathe out at all. Again, all you depend on is elasticity of your lungs and removal of diaphragm contraction and external intercostal contraction. So let's take a look at the diaphragm and the external intercostals and how it is that they kind of create this pressure change. So the diaphragm, it accounts for 60 to 75% of the volume change in your lungs. That's a substantial change, right? This is a substantial difference, showing you that the largest contributor to that active inspiration is the diaphragm. Now, normally, the diaphragm has a dome-like shape to it, where it's inverted upward into the thoracic cavity. When the diaphragm contracts, it pushes downward and it kind of flattens like this. And the flattening of that diaphragm increases your thoracic volume, which increases your lung volume. Because again, the lungs are suctioned to everything that's in that thoracic cage. So wherever that thoracic cage goes, the lungs go with it. Okay? So you'll see that it has made the lung volume bigger. And because the lung volume is bigger, what has happened to pressure inside of the lungs? It has decreased. Because the pressure in the lungs has decreased, you can see these blue arrows showing you that air is moving in, because the air in the atmosphere has a higher pressure than the air inside of the lungs. So we have a high to low pressure system. When do you think airflow stops? And don't say at the peak of inspiration, because that's relatively obvious. I mean in terms of pressure. So when will there be no airflow into the lungs anymore? So when pressure inside the lungs and outside the lungs are matched, they're the same, right? That means that there's no gradient anymore. And if there's no gradient, there's no flow. That happens at the peak of inspiration, right? So you've breathed in and you breathe in as much as you are going to for that one cycle. So pressures match each other, okay? What happens next is the diaphragm relaxes because it stops receiving nerve signals. And when it relaxes, the diaphragm goes back to its original size, that it's relaxed state. It's not contracted or anything like that, which then kind of pushes on those lungs a little bit, and thoracic volume has now decreased. If thoracic volume decreases, what happens to the pressure in the lungs? It is increased. So now lung pressure is greater than atmospheric, and so air flows out of the lungs into the atmosphere down that pressure gradient. That again will continue, and air will continuously flow until your pressures are matched. And so that's at the end of expiration, where you've kind of released all the air you need to for that particular respiratory cycle. Okay? External intercostals, they help. Scalenes, they help. Okay? They don't account for as much of a thoracic volume change, but nonetheless account for a change. So here we have the thoracic, or rather the overall change, anywhere from 25 to 40%. The scalenes and external intercostals function as what has been created as an analogy to the water pump, which I don't know if any of you have ever seen one. I mean, you've seen one if you've been camping, okay? I don't know that they really have them anyplace else nowadays. So maybe that analogy should change. And then the bucket handle. The water pump is this big iron structure that comes out of the ground, and literally you just pull it up and down. And then the bucket handle, you guys all know what a bucket handle looks like. It's rounded, right? So what this represents is that the external intercostals and the scalenes pull on your ribs in a way that elevates them anteriorly like that water pump, and then all around your body like a bucket handle. So that you're not only depressing, creating a change within the thoracic cavity from a vertical standpoint, but you're also doing it externally and kind of on a horizontal axis, where you're allowing the ribs to kind of bow out laterally and in front of you, as well as the diaphragm then compressing. The combination of all of that makes the chest get big, right? Large volume, which then changes the pressures in the lung. All of that combined is going to help you move that air down its pressure gradients. Okay? Good. So if we start thinking about this again, be as intuitive and as straightforward with your thought process as you can be. So, as the diaphragm contracts and the thoracic cavity expands, which of the following would be true about the pressure in the alveoli? Gas exchange in gas exchange chapter.
Oh, it's on this one.
Oh, was it really? Yeah, it's gas exchange stuff.
Okay, so I can hear it.
Yeah, because it'll be on the, when we talk about like oxygen diffusing, carbon dioxide diffusing. That's where it's more applicable. We're doing it in gas exchange. So I'm not sure why it's here. I might not have updated your guys's. It might be in the gas exchange PowerPoint again. I might have had it in there again. But yeah, it's more applicable there. That's why. I might have changed that some semester and then forgot to change your guys's. Yeah. We will do it at some point. Couple more seconds. Okay. So, as the diaphragm contracts and the volume in that thoracic cavity increases, what's going to happen to alveolar pressure? So what's going to happen to alveolar pressure in this case? It's going to decrease, right? Simple Boyle's law relationship. Volume goes up, pressure goes down. Volume goes down, pressure goes up. Okay? Now, when we take a look at what's happening in a respiratory cycle, we can graph it. We can put it on paper and figure out exactly what's going on during a full respiratory cycle. So let's start actually at the very bottom where the black trace is. This down here shows you how many respiratory cycles. 2. Because I have air moving in, peak of inspiration, air moving out, end of expiration. So the yellow is inspiration, the blue is expiration. And you can see that indicated right here. So I have one respiratory cycle followed by a second. Okay? Now we're going to talk about all of the events taking place in a single respiratory cycle. As we discuss this, we're going to ignore the middle blue section for now, because while it is important, it is not an integral part of understanding airflow and pressure, at least not for right now, okay? So we're going to leave that out for a minute, and we're just going to talk about the red and the black, okay? The red is measuring alveolar pressure, which is the pressure in the inside of your lungs, okay? It's measured at the alveoli because ultimately that's where gas exchange takes place. So we're most interested in that pressure gradient since we need air to get down in there and then from there back out. The black is representing air movement in milliliters. So how many milliliters of air do I bring in the inspiration, and how many milliliters of air do I expel through my expiration? A1, if we follow that down to the black trace, tells me that there's no air moving. So there's no air coming in and there's no air going out. We can understand that from looking at this pressure measurement over here. You'll notice there's 0 pressure, +1, +2, and then -1, -2. I appreciate the simplicity, but I don't want to create confusion. So let's make sure we understand what this means. It says 0 pressure because there's no difference between alveoli and atmosphere. Okay? It says -1 because alveolar pressure is less than atmosphere. There's not actually negative pressure in the lung. Okay? And so that's why I want to make sure we don't create a misconception that the lung has negative pressure, because that will never be true. Okay? So then if it says +1, it just means that the alveolar pressure is greater than the pressure in the atmosphere. Good. So if we look at A1, it goes right along 0. There's no pressure difference at all, which would make sense why there's no air movement at all, because there's no gradient for that air to follow. So now we'll see as we transition from A1 down to A2 that alveolar pressure has decreased. And the reason it has decreased is because we're starting that inspiratory cycle. So the diaphragm is contracted, and that's created a drop in pressure. Okay? So now there's a pressure gradient. Because we're at this -1, we have created a high pressure in the atmosphere, low pressure in the lungs. So air is going to start to flow in. As air flows into the lung, you'll notice that alveolar pressure starts to increase because we're adding air into the lung. And as you add more air, pressure of that air is going to start to rise. Okay? So that coincides with this rise right here, this whole upward slope of inspiration. Inspiration begins when I drop this pressure so that I get a pressure gradient. And that pressure gradient exists all the way until I get back to 0, where there's no longer a pressure difference between atmosphere and lungs. So you've reached the peak of your inspiration. So A3 coincides with this point right here, C2, very top of inspiration, because you brought in everything you need to. Pressures are matched. There's no more air movement. Okay? Then what's going to happen? Diaphragm and external intercostals relax, which causes thoracic volume to decrease. The decrease in thoracic volume will increase alveolar pressure, and so air will start to flow out of the lungs, and air continues to flow out of the lungs, dropping that pressure until once again we are matched with the atmosphere. So from essentially A3 through A4, A5, we're breathing out from the peak of that inspiration until we end up at the bottom again where there's no more air exchange because there is no pressure gradient between atmosphere and lungs. Okay? And so we can explain air movement by understanding all of these different alveolar pressures. The blue part, that's something called interpleural pressure. Okay? You'll notice that it's always defined as being subatmospheric, lower than that of the atmosphere, because it is this kind of cavity between your parietal and visceral pleura. And you have to remember some of the properties of the lung. The lung is very elastic. The rib cage is a fixed structure. It's really not going anywhere. So the elasticity of the lung pulls forward, or rather inward, I should say. And because it pulls inward, it kind of pulls off of the rib cage a little bit, creating a cavity. that's kind of a suction cavity, so it is a lower than atmosphere pressure. And it kind of maintains that lower than atmosphere pressure. So when the lungs start to fill, you kind of compress that cavity a little bit so the pressure goes up. And then when the lungs empty, you're allowing that cavity to kind of reestablish itself, and so the pressure goes down. And that's really what this kind of blue trace more or less represents. Now, is intrapleural pressure really that important? It's actually really essential to lung function. If you disrupt this membrane here, remember it's subatmospheric, lower than atmospheric pressure, right? So if, let's say, I were to poke a hole into this cavity, and I poke a hole between the atmosphere and that pleural space, where is air going to go? Into that pleural space, right? Because it's subatmospheric, so there's a pressure gradient. And as air goes into there, there's no longer a suction holding the lung in place on the rib cage. So the lung is going to collapse. Okay? That's what a pneumo... Oh, no. That's for Thursday. Ah! Hold on. Mayday. Okay. That's what a pneumothorax is. A pneumothorax is when something perforates that cavity. Okay? I have exactly 0 reasons for why your textbook uses a knife. Because this came from your textbook. I mean, it could have been a broken rib, which is a little bit more applicable to what you guys... I mean, you might see this. But again, regardless, she chose a knife. That's fine. Either way, you're perforating that sealed off cavity because it's a closed cavity. And when that perforation occurs, atmospheric air flows in because you have that pressure gradient. And because of that, air is going to fill all of this space right here, and the lung's incredible elasticity causes it to collapse. Now, without that suction, the lung can't follow the rib cage when you breathe. So that lung isn't going to fill at all. When that lung is collapsed, it cannot fill. So a lot of times people ask, well, how do you even fix something like this? You have to reestablish that intrapleural pressure. The way that they do something like this, let's say in emergent cases, a car accident, broken ribs, something like that, is they take a big barrel syringe, put it into the hole, and suck out air. Because that reestablishes that negative pressure, so less than atmospheric. The lung resuctions to the sides of the rib cage, and then they have to seal the hole. So they put gauze, tape, all kinds of stuff, so that atmospheric air doesn't go in there anymore. And that helps to reestablish it. From there, that's emergent, okay? From there, certainly there's surgery that needs to be done. But that's how they can reestablish that after a pneumothorax has occurred. Okay, I'll see you guys on Thursday. Have a good day. If you have any questions, let me know.